sports are really important vehicles for relationships.
We have purpose. We have a why. We bring people together. We connect.
I feel like God is our greatest supporter and our greatest coach.
Welcome to Rabbi on the Sidelines. This is Rabbi Sherman from Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. This week we are joined by an author, a journalist who literally has written a library of books about sports and other amazing topics. Gary Belsky, author of On the Origins of Sports, Up Your Game, ESPN The Magazine presents The Answer Guy, New York Times bestselling author, former editor-in-chief of ESPN Magazine, and president of Elland Road Partners. Gary, it's so great to have you. Thanks for joining.
My pleasure. But every year I take a stand on Facebook against something that is both important but insignificant. And about 3 years ago, I took a stand against the misuse of the words literally and exactly. 3 books does not literally make a library.
Well, actually, depending on the digital library that these young kids have, 1 book might make a library today.
Oh, so, okay, fair point. You're allowed to fight back.
Well, thanks for joining us. And the reason I reached out to you earlier in the year was an article that you wrote specifically about faith in sports, and that's the Ryan Turell story, which we'll get into in a minute. But I want to back up to this book right here, On the Origins of Sports, because so many of us were born into loving the games that we love right now, but never really thinking about where they came from originally, and if that had any impact on how we love the game, or even if those athletes today would even be good at the sports that they're playing if they had these original rules that I read of sticks and balls and everything like that. So why did you go back to the beginning, and what led you to that research of where did sports come from in the first place?
I'm glad you brought up that book, because you referred to me as a New York Times bestselling author, which I am, but only for that book. Oh. I have written many books, and not all of them get on the New York Times bestseller list. That book came from an interesting sort of confluence of circumstances and events. With my business partner, as you mentioned kindly, I run a firm called Elland Road Partners, and we are a storytelling studio. Essentially, we solve problems for different kinds of organizations or individuals, nonprofits, Fortune 500 companies, sports leagues, whatever the case. And we have a client that's a publisher. And the head of the company brought us in because they were trying to figure out a strategy. Most of the books they sell to women, just because of where they focus on these beautiful books that they make. And they were trying to sell books to men. And so we came back and said 2 things. One was, don't necessarily try to sell books directly to men. It might make more sense to sell books for men to women who might buy them as gifts, etc. Mm-hmm. And also, you should hire us to write books for you, because we spent a long time writing books for both men and women who are sports fans, but also men. And so the head of the company asked us for some ideas, and I've always been interested in the people I worked with at ESPN The Magazine and ESPN Insider. We were always interested in the rules of sports, the original rules. Like, mm-hmm. How did we get here? And it's funny, because I used to say, how did we get from people running around in the forest playing with pig bladders stuffed with grass, right, to rugby or soccer or football? And it's funny, because I'm a kosher keeping Jew, not Orthodox, but observant in some ways. And I'd never imagined I would write a book that would refer to pig bladder so often. And it turns out, by the way, that the reason that animal bladders, not just from pigs, but from all animals, were the original balls stuffed with grass or rocks, was because bladders, literally in a in a nose to tail resource society, really, Neanderthals or before that, when you're eating every aspect of an animal that you catch, the only thing you don't eat, you eat all the organs, you eat brains, you even, you suck the marrow out of bones. The only organ you basically don't eat is a bladder, because it's actually a very thick, almost rubbery kind of organ. And so those were the ones that were left around, and eventually kids, probably, but maybe young adults too, started stuffing them with grass and sort of playing with balls. So we were just interested in, how did we get here to all of these different sports? So we managed to find the original rules, where a sport went from being something lots of people played in different ways to a sport that we all can recognize. And we can talk about that in a second. But we had managed to find the original rules for 20 different sports. Right. And we wrote a book. Basically, what we pitched to them was, We would tell the story of each sport up to those original rules, and then we would annotate those rules in a Talmudic fashion. It's actually the words we use, because we took the original rules, because some of them you wouldn't even understand what the sport was if you read them now, but the original essence of the sport is contained in them. And so we wrote Rashi and Tosfot on them. We did commentary on them to explain what was going on and what changed significantly.
And when you saw that, were you surprised? Obviously, look, I was born into the era of NCAA when there were 3-pointers. I was born into the era where, baseball looks pretty much what they look today. But even when they make rules changes today, I get upset because that's not the baseball that I knew. That's not the basketball that I knew. Take us back to the evolution. Let's just talk baseball for a second, because I find it fascinating. Just the first couple of pages, you talk about Egyptians running around with sticks and balls. Do you think there were any faith aspects that were involved in some of those original rules that you found?
Oh, we know there were some of the the original rules of baseball are from I think the 1840s. So no, they were not. There was no. Although there was a lot of fervor, there was not necessarily faith, but certainly a lot of the games that we talk about and a lot of the rules that we explored came from rituals and rites that had to do with servicing some deity or another, some god or another. I think there were, original origins. A lot of competition, in fact, was often, or some competition was part of festivals and rites that were meant to serve the Lord, the scary thing in the sky that controlled everything. So yeah, we didn't explore a lot of that in the book, but I do think there were some faith-based origins to some of our sports, if not some of the rules of the sports that we use now. The biggest surprise of the book was just, when you investigate every sport like we did, you just find things that you would never expect, and that, were delightful, shocking, whatever the case may be.
And so this is a clip that you had on the talk show about specifically the origins of sports, and has sports improved?
For the most part, I think sports have improved with codification, with athletes improving, with better equipment and better fields and more accurate officiating, things of that nature.
And
so when you talk about equipment, for instance, there's a fascinating diagram in your book on football and the helmet, right? And how basically it went from no helmet then to the bar and now face mask. And now you look at things, like Damar Hamlin and sort of the concussion protocol and all those types of things that are happening right now. Has it improved, or are we in the same spot that we were, just in a different fashion?
Well, I think the answer is probably both. You are a close reader, Rabbi, so I'm impressed. Yeah, the helmet thing is actually a particularly relevant subject matter. Everybody's worried about concussions and everybody thinks a lot about helmets. But in fact, the helmets that were brought into football to protect people from head injuries are probably the reason why football has become such a dangerous sport, because in fact, in the original rules of football that we use, which is I believe the 1906 rules in the sporting for Spalding, which was an equipment manufacturer, the original rules of football as we know it, which is when the forward pass was introduced. That's what we determined was the separation between rugby and football. You can't do a forward pass in rugby, but you can in football. The original rules were came from Spalding, and college football was the big game. And there were a lot of people dying in college football, often from crushed skulls. And so they introduced the helmet as de rigueur, like it was going to be permanent, and they described what it would be made from. But by giving players helmets, you end up empowering them to use their head as weapons.
Right.
So in a funny way, the thing that was meant to protect people, for a while it did, because in the beginning, people were not using them as their heads as weapons as much as they evolved in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s before they banned that rule. And so helmets, which were meant to protect broken skulls, did. But what it increased was concussions, because people, it turns out that you don't have to break your skull to get concussed. In fact, you don't even have to get concussed to really harm your brain. You just have to bounce it around a lot. And helmets meant to protect actually encourage people to bounce their brains around without realizing it.
And do you find any other sports where there were unintended consequences of what people thought were going to be positive safety protocols or different rules that had these consequences of making people a little more unafraid because they feel more protected?
Well, certainly, I mean, be careful what you wish for because it may come
Yes.
true, right? It's something
Right.
like that. Or I think it's when God punishes people, he grants their wishes.
Mhm.
I, by the way, the football helmet is far and away the best example of that. But I certainly think that for a long time, as cars became quote unquote safer, as cars got better, as the engines got better, as the reinforcements around the driver's cockpit got better, we thought that it was more safe for drivers when in fact it was more safe for certain kinds of injuries, but less safe for catastrophic injuries. And in fact, what we learned again was with when Dale Earnhardt died, was that a sense of invincibility when you're driving in a car is the last thing that you actually want. On the one hand, when people always ask me about race car drivers, are they athletes? I'm like, oh yeah, for a whole bunch of reasons. But
Mhm.
their sense of invincibility is very athletic. But if you can get bounced around in a car and not suffer any outward damage and die, which is
Right.
essentially what happened to Dale Earnhardt Sr., not Jr., when he died in what looked like a very minor crash, and certainly a crash in which the car was fine because the padding on the car and the bumpers and the structure was so strong. But in the end, his body couldn't handle the whiplash. Now, by the way, when you race in a car, your head is essentially strapped to
Wow.
your seat because you don't want whiplash. That's the
Right.
danger.
And even the fan experience, I'm talking about baseball right now, right? When I was a kid, I would love to sit behind the dugout because you can catch a foul ball with those line drives that might hit you in the head. But now I want to sit up further because you have the screen going all the way down to left and right field. And even first and third base coaches are wearing helmets, right? So like, when do you think that common sense comes into play of like, oh my gosh, people are being hurt. We have to protect people in order to make this game a positive thing.
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much about common sense as it is about trying to maximize experiences. We are a hedonistic species and we're always trying to maximize experiences. And so there's like a balance that we do all. I mean, look, let's be frank. We, as a society and as individuals, we are comfortable with certain levels of risk in everything.
Right.
We have 35 to 40,000 traffic accidents every year. I don't know if you know this, but I have a kind of a side career where I write and lecture about the psychology of decision making. So I think about this stuff all the time, and it applies to sports. We have a societal acceptance of basically 40,000 people a year are going to die in car accidents, and we could really, really keep cars and
Mhm.
and lower the incidence of automobile death simply by putting a sharp metal spike on a steering wheel. If you put a sharp metal spike at the center of every steering wheel, people would drive much slower because that sharp metal spike would scare them. But that would eliminate a lot of the pleasantness about driving a car. So we don't have that sharp metal spike. We basically hope people will follow the rules and not crash into each other. That doesn't always work. And so sports is no different. We're always trying to balance the experience of playing and the experience of spectating with the inherent dangers in projectile. I mean, remember, a lot of sports came from acts of war. Most
Right.
of the original track and field games were about warfare skills. You practiced pole vaulting because you had to vault over stone walls as you march through Europe pillaging. You practiced discus throwing and the hammer throw because they were weapons, right? So the sports is inherently dangerous, and we're okay with that. To some extent, by the way, that's why it took a little while for women who are just as competitive as men, just as athletically talented. It took a while for societies to accept women's sports, partially because deep in our amygdala, we were uncomfortable with the idea of women warriors. But by the way, women make perfectly good warriors too. But we were societally or species-wide uncomfortable. And because sports does descend in many ways from warfare and violent competition, it took a while for us to recognize that like women have the same desires and needs to compete against each other, to watch other women and other men compete, same as men.
So we're going to talk a little bit later about, are these values of war and warrior and sports compatible with, let's say, our tradition of Judaism, specifically in the Ryan Turell story. But I want to bring up another clip that you talked about. What are the ideals that are signified in sports? Because we talk about the minutia of the rules, but what does it mean in the overall picture? Why do I have this drive to watch a team, to follow a team? And this is what you said.
That's the reasons why sports matters and why we care so much about it is it's a way we signify ideals. like what we think about sportsmanship and effort and teamwork and camaraderie and discipline and all this stuff. So because it's a signifier for us, because it's a way that we get to have these discussions and tell ourselves what matters, people are therefore going to have these outsized opinions and strong feelings about it. So that's why sports works.
So sports works. It does. I love going to any sporting event, right? You put me in front of, it doesn't matter if there's one person or 50,000 people there. I love it. What does it signify for us as human beings?
By the way, this is a very meta interview because you have me watching video of me watching video.
It's okay. Mine will come up next. So I'm with you.
I mean, I have at ESPN we talked a lot. There's a lot of there were and are a lot of very smart people at ESPN who are interested in lots of other things aside from sports. And we talked a lot about why do people care about laundry? Effectively, that's what you do. You care about laundry. There's a shirt that has the St. Louis Cardinals, which I think we all can agree represents all that's good and righteous in sports. Far and away the best, the most storied team in the National League, pardon me, Dodger fans, and arguably the most storied team in baseball because the National League really is the only league that counts. But why do I care so much about the Cardinals uniform? And I think it's because it signifies these things, right? I think it's because it signifies things that deep down matter. I'm also an Arizona Cardinals fan. They are arguably the worst franchise in Major League professional sports, meaning they have the longest drought since they've won a championship. They abandoned my city the year after I abandoned my city, so I couldn't really hold them to account for that. It's not a very good franchise, but I am a proud fan of them. And I think what I'm signaling to the world is I am a loyal person. I am a person who is invested. I'm a person you can count on. I'm not doing that consciously, but I think most of the reasons we root for sports, we root for teams, we root for athletes is because we are signifying to ourselves and to other people things that matter to us: sportsmanship, effort, focus, discipline. When people admire players, they're admiring the way they play, they're admiring how they got there. And I think that's why sports is so powerful, because we are talking to ourselves and we are talking to our communities and to the wider world. I'm sure as you shake your head that you are saying, wow, that sounds familiar. That sounds a little bit like how we are with religion, right? Religion, you could argue, is a not God, but religion is a human invented construct for virtue signaling in the best way, not virtue signaling in the way that it's used in stupid online debates, but virtue signaling in the way that we are meant to signal to ourselves and to the people who matter to us, and even to strangers, by the way, which is very important, especially when religion was invented. The way we signal to all of these people that we are to be trusted, that we are people who are worthwhile, that we are people to collaborate with, to marry, to mate with, to share food with. Sports and religion are very connected in terms of the impulses that drive interest and participation in both, I think.
And actually, when I started this project, it was a Zoom project, and I love sports. I had the passion for it growing up in Syracuse, as you see Coach Boeheim and Carmelo behind me. They inspired on the court, but I also saw what they did off the court, but I also saw how it brought a community together. And during COVID, I said, wait, I've met some people that I know if we talk to them about in the heart and soul and not the box scores and trade deadlines, they're going to say some interesting things. And what started as 2 Zoom interviews has now been a 2-year project of meeting people like you. And when I read an article and book like you, it's the behind the scenes, right? The fact that you don't write about Talmud and Rashi and Tosafot, but the fact that you explain that's why you did it, these connections are becoming very, very apparent, not just to me, but also to people that are becoming part of this sports and faith community as well. And specifically in the, maybe you can, right? The Kyrie aspects and the Kanye aspects. The Kyrie stuff obviously hit the sports world, right? And that was one of the first times that they began asking religious leaders, well, what does this mean for religion and sports together? So we'd love maybe your take on how anti-Semitism is alive and well, but how sports can be a thing that can bring us together and not be divisive like we saw over this last couple months.
Yeah, I mean, anti-Semitism is alive and well because humans are alive and well, right? There's lots of if you went into Kashmir in India and you talked about religion dividing people and bringing out the absolute worst in people over not just centuries, but millennia, they would never mention anti-Semitism. They would laugh that was the oldest kind of you know, opprobrium between peoples. They would talk about the nastiness between Hindu and Muslims, right? To some extent, first of all, Jews are, while I'm very concerned always about anti-Semitism, Jews sort of kind of sometimes think that they have the corner on the worst kind of religious hatred. And there's all sorts of, humans are very creative when it comes to religious hatred, because really what humans are very good at doing is identifying other, right? As humans evolved, it was a necessary way for our brains to process the world, which was to identify other, meaning my mom and dad and my brothers and sisters, they're me. They're part of me. I can trust them. Everybody else, I have to make evaluations as to whether or not they're with me or against me. I'm simplifying all of this. Right. But our brains evolved to make those decisions. And so anti-Semitism is alive and well because otherness is alive and well. Racism, all sorts of things come from that. And does that exist in sports? Certainly. But really, in my opinion, only because humans are playing sports. I don't think it's a particular problem. And I would argue that, like, you know, I'm a inveterate optimist. I am Irene Belsky's son. May she rest in peace. And my mom sort of was, you know, was one of the most optimistic people in the world. And I, in general, think that the human experience and the human experiment keeps getting better and better, even though it's incremental, and it's a little bit like the stock market in that it kind of goes up, but it goes up like that. Right. With lots of steps backward, but more steps forward. So I think anti-Semitism in general, we have moments in my lifetime where it's in sports and without sports, it's more of a problem. But I think overall it's getting better. But I do think, you know, and the bigger issue is what we should glean from athletes and what we should take from them and how much it should matter what they say. And of course, sometimes it does matter what they say, even if we don't want it to matter what they say. But you have Jim Boeheim and Carmelo Anthony, you know, in revered positions on your walls. I can make a good case about not having either one of them on your walls because they're human and they have flaws, right? But we leave it to ourselves and we leave it to others to make choices about what they take from human beings who are in exalted positions and what they leave behind as the failings of human beings. And so that's just a dialogue that needs to constantly happen. We have to always be talking about it, you know, and what we should do is lean into the people who are modeling behavior as we want. I think it's extraordinary. You know, my business partner and I talk a lot about LeBron James, not just the extraordinary nature, who's now in Los Angeles. So I'm sure you're even more familiar with him, but he's hard not to be familiar with if you follow sports at all. His life, forget about his career, is extraordinarily stellar and admirable and worthwhile. The biggest controversy of his career was a decision to televise his choice to switch teams, the money from which was going to go to a tzedakah, right? Like the decision, the money from that broadcast was publicly intended and did go to charity. And that's the worst thing that LeBron James has ever done. And so many people talk smack about him. And I'm just thinking like, oh my God, he's just lived such a life of effort and hard work and morals and raising children well and being a good spouse as far as we know, and trying to be on the right side of issues, et cetera. Like I prefer to lean into the players and the athletes and the coaches that evidence the best in humanity rather than the flaws in humanity. Not even the worst, because it's like nothing anybody says in a press conference interview or in a locker room interview is the worst of anything. Like we live in a world in which we can easily identify really bad behavior, and nothing a tired, exhausted athlete says under the lights in a locker room should be taken that seriously ever.
So one of those people that seems to be doing pretty good for the world, and specifically the other, meaning wearing a kipa on a G League court right now, is Ryan Turell. When I grew up in Syracuse and I graduated high school in 2000, it was the Tamir Goodman effect. Tamir and I have become good friends from not coast to coast, but from the U.S. to Israel. And I remember showing my basketball coach, this is why I can't play on Friday night because of this kid in Baltimore. And his effect now 2 decades later has perhaps led to Ryan Turell. Ryan came to Sinai Temple a couple months ago with Enes Kanter Freedom. We brought 100 Jewish, Christian, and Muslim children here. He ran a clinic, and then we did a talk back. And one of the questions I asked him was based on your article about his Valley Torah experience. And when his dad said, go to another school or besides YU, he's told his dad, well, why did you send me to a Jewish yeshiva, Valley Torah High School? And this is what he said about why he went to YU.
My decision, it came down to, can I be a religious Jew? Is going D1, good enough for me to worth me sacrificing my religion, right? And stopping my faith because I want to I played Division I basketball. And when it came down to it, it just wasn't. And, I've seen people in the past that made that decision, because of the clout of Division I basketball. And I wanted to be able to set the pathway for, the Jewish kids and any kid, watching, that it doesn't matter where you come from, you could succeed, and just stay true to who you are and stay true to what you believe, and you'll make it.
So Ryan Turell, now they're selling kosher food at the Motor City Cruise game. He was just in LA.
It's about time.
There's kids with yarmulkes and day schools going to the G League games to follow him. Maybe a little comment about him, but then your article in November of 2021. Is that ESPN that comes to you and says, this kid's amazing? Or is it you that recognize the other and tell ESPN, this story needs to be told not just for the Jewish community, but for the entire sports and faith world?
Well, you do like the backstory of things. So I was a working reporter and writer for 14 years, and then a working full-time editor for 14 years. And then about 10 years ago, I started Elland Road Partners, and we do a lot of interesting storytelling, video, writing, podcasts, whatever the case may be. But I'm not a journalist anymore, but I try to keep my hand in it a little bit. So I try to do 1 or 2 stories a year. Although I think I'm somewhat talented, I am not a person that people are coming to. They're waiting for me to come to them. And so I noticed that when Yeshiva University had, it was a weird time. It was during the pandemic, but they had this very long winning streak. And at some point it became the longest active winning streak in men's college basketball, by the way, because one of the things I realized when I did research into it wasn't the longest current streak in college basketball. It was the men, because there was a really amazing Christian school run by a fantastic coach in Michigan called Hope College. That was a women's basketball team that had a longer streak. That's also since been broken. So when I looked into it, I was thinking that's just interesting. And mostly I was taken by the fact that it got a lot of attention in major news outlets. And the reason it got a lot of attention in major news outlets, as opposed to the Hope women's basketball team, was not really because it was men's basketball as much as because it was yeshiva basketball, meaning Jewish basketball, because there's this idea that I was always vaguely aware of that that Jews are not quite as good are not as good at sports as they are at, intellectual pursuits. And it's funny because I co-wrote a book about behavioral economics. It's called Why Smart People Make Big Money Mistakes, but I wrote it with a guy named Tom Gilovich, who's the chairman of the psychology department at Cornell. And Tom wrote a book called How We Know What Isn't So. It's a fantastic book. It's a small textbook from the early 90s. You can still buy it. How We Know What Isn't So. And it's basically this idea that we think we know a lot of things that they're actually not true. And he write about the psychology of it. And what I knew, because I was a sports editor, was that Jews have actually, in the same way that Jews earn more Nobel Prizes than you would expect them to, Jews have excelled in sports more than you would expect them to, based on their population proportions. And yet people have this idea, there's jokes about it in movies, in pop culture, that Jews aren't good at sports. So when you write 1 or 2 stories a year, you often write about things that you want to write about. I believe the best hummus in the world is at a taxi stand in Jerusalem. And so I waited to find a food magazine that would let me write a story about hummus. And people disagree, by the way, but some people, and so I looked for a place to write that story. So all of a sudden, to be honest with you, a little bell went off in my head and said, like, oh, this might be a chance where I get to write about a couple of things that I'm interested in. I'm interested in why it is that people think Jews are bad at sports. What's that about? And I'm interested in a couple other things that I thought might come up, team chemistry and a few things like that. And so I went to ESPN and I sort of said, here's what's going on, and here's what I want to do with the story. And the editors at ESPN were gracious enough to sort of trust me, because they were going to spend some money and devote a lot of virtual ink and editing time, more importantly, to what was going to be a pretty involved and deep story. I spent several months on that story because they sort of bought the premise. And so that's how that came about.
And so, as I read that article, many of the people that you interviewed, in fact, have appeared on this show. One of them is Dr. Jeffrey Gurak, professor of American Jewish history at
He's
Yeshiva
great.
University. He's amazing, wrote very academic books about exactly what you're saying, like do Jews belong in sports, and the reason why, perhaps the stereotype of not. And this is what he said about specifically the word Maccabees, and we'll talk about that, of why you were called the Maccabees, even though, based on our earlier conversation, they're sort of the anti-warrior, and there's a debate about that. This is what he said about why Jews in America had to become maybe in the more warrior mentality.
And the answer has a lot to do with the beginnings of the Zionist movement, which your viewers and listeners should know about. In 1898, at the Second Zionist Congress, Dr. Max Nordau got up and said, we need to have muscular Judentums, strong Jews, to fight against the world in a variety of worlds, perhaps on the sports venue, and perhaps ultimately militarily. We have to get away from this idea of the callow Jew. So when we call ourselves the Maccabees, we're linking ourselves to the motto, one of the mottos of the Zionist movement. And the other thing about the Maccabean games, or Maccabean clubs that existed in Austria and Germany and Hungary and Romania before World War II, is that the Jews who wanted to play sports were denied the right to participate in.
So this warrior mentality within the Jews, do we have to get in the ring? And boxing was a popular sport for Jews. Now it's not necessarily so. How has that shifted from the time Dr. Gurak's talking to now, where it's a more open society where Jews are not just owners and managers, but they are on the court? And is there another Ryan Turell that can happen over the next couple of years?
Well, you mean a Jew excelling at basketball or an Orthodox Jew? Because we just saw Sue Bird just retired, and Sue Bird is one of the best basketball players in the history of the world, and she's Jewish. So
I think the deeper observance aspect, right? When I was growing up, it was the BYU effect. One of my earlier guests on this show is Joe Lenardi, and he says, it's not in his book, Bracketology, it's not fair that BYU gets not to play. Like, these are the rules, NCAA, you deal with it or you don't play. But now you see BYU not playing on Sundays. You see Ryan Turell either walking from the hotel or not playing on Friday, Saturday. So I guess I'm asking a outwardly religious person whose observance might contradict with their sports responsibilities.
I mean, part of it, you're asking a question that requires sort of a couple of walks down different paths. One is, do I think there's more acceptance to diversity of all kinds, neurodiversity, religious diversity, all sorts of diversity? Certainly. And so do I, right now, by the way, completely coincidentally, the coach of the Yeshiva University basketball team has a son who is an Orthodox Jew who's playing, minor league baseball.
Steinmetz, he's the best.
Right. And so I think, he's a pitcher, and there's every reason in the world to think that if he continues to go, he'll be able to figure out how to play. So I think that's possible. I certainly, to the extent that sports are about culture, and there's and team chemistry. And so there is a kind of, alchemy that has to happen for somebody who is somehow separate from everybody else to also be able to fit in with everybody else. So that's always a challenge. But by the way, that was a challenge in the 70s when so many African-American players were converting from Christianity to Islam, and they were kind of very much making themselves different even than other Black players on their teams, and sports adjusted to that as well. And so I think, do I think it's likely? No, because I'm a big believer in probabilities. Do I think it'll probably happen here and there? Yes, certainly. The question is sort of what kind of accommodations are you okay making? My mom was an observant Jewish woman, and she was the head nurse of a labor and delivery floor at the Jewish hospital in St. Louis. And we understood that sometimes she was going to work on Shabbat because it was not directly pikuach nefesh, meaning, the protection of life. It was very related to it. And so we just understood. And more importantly, she was making her own decisions. And with the spiritual advisors she talked to, that it was okay to work on the Sabbath sometimes in order to do that. Is it as okay to be a baseball player, even if you're not technically violating Shabbat, but you're earning the money? Do you have to donate the money that you make on the Shabbat. There's a lot of complications in this. By the way, I didn't talk about this in the story because it wasn't the appropriate place. Yeshiva University basketballs, Yeshiva University sports are in itself in a giant complicated situation because, as you may or may not know, Moshe Feinstein, who is the intellectual, I would say foundational pillar of the Yeshiva University, the movement that underpins Yeshiva University, wrote a tshuva about 45 years ago. He wrote what's the English word for tshuva? Like a responsa, like an essay about where he was, like a statement of opinion or a statement. And his belief was sports did not belong at Yeshiva University.
Right.
And basically, I didn't want to put them on the hot seat. I mean, I talked to them about it, but I didn't put it in the story because it was inside baseball, no pun intended, in the journalistic phrase. But like you could argue Yeshiva University, the guy who kind of gave the intellectual heft to the Yeshiva University movement was basically saying, we shouldn't play sports because they take us away from other more important things. And because spectating sports is actually a bad thing in and of itself, right? There's an argument that you could parse it where, well, we can play sports because it's physical fitness and it teaches good values, but we shouldn't let people watch sports because there's a phrase, I just forgot it. Rabbi Yolkut, who I quoted in that story, Eliana Yolkut at Addis Israel in Washington, gave me a quote that said, there's a phrase for like what it's like sitting among the wicked that because by the way, they had spectator sports when the rabbis were crafting the Torah and they refer the Mishnah, excuse me.
Yep,
and they
in the Colosseum.
Yep. And they talked about like, you can't sitting among those people is bad because people can get nasty and sports fans in Philadelphia hadn't even been invented as a city.
It's actually interesting that you say that.
So YU is involved in it. Like sports is both beautiful, but also complicated.
And I think that complicated piece is interesting. You mentioned Coach Steinmetz, also a good friend of the show. And I have a clip here specifically saying what he's up against when he's recruiting. When a kid's in Israel for the year in yeshiva and he says, you know what, I need to study a little more Gemara. And this is what Coach Steinmetz said. I love this quote.
A first-team all-conference player probably about 5 years ago or 6 years ago who was a sophomore who decided to leave and go study full-time. He wanted to go learn full-time and become a rabbi and all that. And I have a very, very simple personal rule. I don't recruit against the base measures. I never do it.
I love that. Can you repeat that? I don't recruit against the base measures. That is amazing. Yeah, the Coach K says the same thing, I think. Yeah, John Shire, Coach Boeheim. I don't recruit against the Beit Midrash, the house of study. I think that's an amazing quote, knowing what he's up against, but also realizing the development of these young people, that basketball is important, but at the end of the day, it's also a game.
Yeah, by the way, he's an impressive guy.
Yes.
If he weren't, first of all, he's rare now among even Division III sports coaches in that he actually has a full-time job.
Right,
he's a
right.
real estate attorney. But he's actually running an offense and running a program that's sort of two of the most, as well as two of the most famed coaches in the history of the sport, Bobby Knight and Hank Iba, I think was the guy who sort of, kind of invented the motion offense. And to be honest with you, he and I have kept in touch. We argue actually, in the Beit Midrash kind of way about lots of things because he's active on social media and I agree with him about a lot of things. Some things, I will take a different opinion, but he's a guy who, if he was not committed to Orthodox Judaism and to yeshiva basketball in particular, I think would have been snapped up by Division I, probably like a mid-major school. Yeah. Wow. I think he's a really smart thinker about basketball. And I think he's a really smart shaper of young men in the way that you have to do it now, because by the way, there's non-religious players on YU.
Right.
He's broadened the tent, or he's opened more flaps on more sides of the tent to sort of, make an Abrahamic reference or a Midrashic Abrahamic reference. And so he's bringing more Jews into the YU tent. And they're just like any other, teenage or post-adolescent athletes in that they have their own ideas about how to run their life. And he's very good at negotiating what is a very delicate walk when it comes to, coaching players today. He's impressive.
And one of his assistant coaches, I think, is as successful in terms of the story between the Black community and the Jewish community. That's Mike Sweetney, who's just an amazing guy. And again, growing up a Syracuse guy, when you talk about enemies and friends, right? Talk to Ahoya was not in my vocabulary, but we have become amazing friends, specifically with Mike's story at Yeshiva University. In fact, Sinai Temple took Mike Sweetney to APAC during the NCAA tournament when right before COVID, and all these YU kids were coming up to him and saying, "Mike, it's the game. Why are you at APAC?" And Mike said, "Oh, Coach Steinmetz says, you know what? There's going to be another NCAA tournament, but you got to go support the U.S.-Israel relationship." And so Mike's opened up a community to the Jewish community, and I think also has opened us up to his own community that he grew up with as well. And so when we talk about the court of solutions, I think what Elliot's Coach Steinmetz is doing is well beyond the players in the court, but really bringing communities together as well.
Yeah, I think he recognizes that he's got a platform and he's trying to do the best he can with it. And so that's because of the power of sports, that's what you can do, which is why sometimes we find the Kyrie Irvings of the world, annoying us or angering us, but you can't quite eat your cake and have it too, right? If we recognize sports as a platform, then lots of people are going to use it as a platform. And that's, in the end, I'm in the marketplace of ideas. I believe the best ideas ultimately will win, not always, and sometimes to catastrophic effect if they don't. Certainly we know that as Jews, but ultimately you have to believe in the liberal experiment. And I mean liberal with a lowercase L, right? The idea that knowledge and the sharing of experiences and culture and custom among human beings takes brings human beings towards a better version of themselves.
And so one last question based on the ESPN The Magazine aspect of your career. And as you said in the beginning, your job is storytelling, which, to be honest, that's also my job. And I've had the honor of interviewing interviewers over the last couple of years and asking them questions of how they ask questions. You mentioned Talmud, you mentioned really a Judaic influence and the Judaic intellectual exercise of what you do both in the sports world and not. How do you choose what stories should be told, maybe what stories aren't ready to be told yet, in order to just make our world a little better today? And maybe just because I grew up reading ESPN The Magazine, a little bit of behind the scenes into how that came about from a TV network to a magazine that I just couldn't wait to get in the mail each as a kid.
So, the first question is complicated is not the right word. The first question has sort of different parts to it, but at this point, I choose stories I want to tell in our work based on, who's hiring us and what stories they want to tell. We do, however, turn down clients if we think either that they are not necessarily the kinds of people we want to be associated with, or their stories are ones we don't want to tell. It's much more the former than the latter. Sometimes we will have people come to us who have quite a bit of resources and they want us to do something perfectly innocuous, but if it's going to help somebody that we don't like make money, we'll just pass on that. But otherwise, so in our business, and we work with all sorts of companies and nonprofits and for-profit corporations, publicly held, privately held, individuals. We'll just, we choose it based on what our capabilities are and whether or not we think they're good actors in the world. For my own personal storytelling, I basically pursue my interests, like things that I'm interested in exploring or things that I think are important to say out loud to the world. The Yeshiva University basketball one was really an exacta for me. I really hit two things. One was I really wanted to explore team chemistry, and two was I really wanted to explore the sort of mythologies or thinking around Jews in sports. Mm-hmm. But I also think something else, which is, I am a 61-year-old, American white male from a, very solidly middle-class background. And I did a lot on my own, but also structurally, I was able to achieve a lot because of where I came from and things I had nothing to do with, right? Good for me for being born into the St. Louis Jewish community, to parents who didn't even pay for me to go to college, but raised me to think, of course I'm going to college, right? So, because of that, I try now to, when I think about stories to put into the universe, a lot of what I do is trying to support people who may not have come from those backgrounds and help them put their stories into the universe. And we don't need to talk about specifics of that, but often what I'm trying to do is help people who, help is the wrong word, but be of use to people who, whether or not that's helping people find jobs, whether or not that's acting as as a sideline editor for people who are trying to write, whether or not that's mentoring people professionally. I try to think about other people's stories. I still have an ego. I still have things that I want to say to the world, but I also want to help people who, or be of use to people who are not in that position. By the way, not least because so many people did that for me.
Right.
Especially, by the way, some of the people that I worked with at ESPN. First of all, my business partner who hired me to work for him at ESPN and then promoted me before I even got there. Like I got hired at one title, and before I came in, he gave me a promotion. But also many of the people at ESPN when I was there got names that may or may not matter to some people, but some of them are quite well known. George Bodenheimer, John Skipper, Gary Honig, people like that who I was a personal finance writer. And a minor TV personality. I used to be on Good Morning America and Oprah talking about money in the 1990s. And I had the chutzpah to think ESPN was starting a magazine. I'll tell you the background on that in a second. And I was thinking like, I've always liked sports. I had only written a couple of freelance stories for Sports Illustrated, but I applied for a job and these people took a bet on me. That was a philosophy that a few of those people that I listed had, that sports journalism was a little bit tired at the time and needed a little bit of a refreshing upgrade. And so they wanted to bring in a new voice that had, and I think that's what appealed to people like you. It's why you went from, we did, it was so successful, was they wanted to bring in a new perspective. And part of that new perspective was, it's a good lesson in life. By the way, we think about it all the time now at Elland Road Partners, was sometimes it's good to get people to contribute to what you're doing who don't necessarily come from the space you're in, because oftentimes it's outsiders who can help the most. What I always tell people is, literally, there are people who learn a lot about factory design from operating room design. There are people who learn a lot about classroom function from orchestra function, right? There's associative learning. And so ESPN was thinking about these things in the late 1980s. Some of the people there were. And so, they gave me a break, and then, things worked out for me. My partner and I kind of combined to work inside the Walt Disney Corporation and inside ESPN. We had an internal partnership, which I always encourage people to do. It oftentimes is a little bit looked at strangely because people hardly ever combine their efforts inside of corporations, but it ended up being very powerful, but mostly because people were accepting of us and our quirkiness. ESPN The Magazine started, by the way, in a funny way, fittingly enough, because of a little bit of competitive spite, which was ESPN was motoring along quite nicely under George Bodenheimer as a very successful television network, and Sports Illustrated, which was a very successful media brand, did a joint venture with CNN to become a television brand in the mid 90s. And basically, I'm shortchanging the story, and it's a more complex business story, but basically my reading of it, the unofficial version is, well, if you guys are going to start a TV network, we're going to start a magazine. Because, by the way, 1998 was not the time to start a magazine, although ESPN The Magazine did extremely well and continues to have an effect even after it closed on the digital and television versions of ESPN. There are still people there. Some of the talent that you recognize were brought in to ESPN through ESPN The Magazine. The magazine industry was about to undergo a gigantic upheaval, and ESPN The Magazine succeeded for 20 years, and it was a big success, et cetera. But it wasn't necessarily the time to start a print magazine. But if Sports Illustrated was going to get in bed with CNN, ESPN was already in bed with Hearst, the media company, and so they decided to start much to my good fortune, they decided to start a print magazine. It was, I have to tell you, for a while there, I've liked every job that I've had. I've had 4 jobs and now my own company. I've liked every job that I had. I got very lucky with that. I think I'm just dumb when it comes to work. I can't believe people pay me to do things in which I get to learn. But when I was working at ESPN, I always told people I have the greatest job in North America. It was just fantastic. Whatever I can see you smiling because I can imagine, first of all, that you really enjoy what you do, but I can also imagine,
I'm on the plane to Bristol right now.
I can already imagine you having a sliding doors moment where you're like, you might have wanted to be a journalist, and I can tell you it's as fun and as interesting as you might imagine. And some of the people that you meet, especially athletes, are just extraordinary, and they are hard workers, and they are famous.
See there? Push try again. Push try again. Still there?
I don't think that was me.
Push it.
I don't think that was me. I think that was you. My internet has stayed alive.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. So I'm going to conclude actually with a, give me 1 second.
Sorry about that. I think that was your internet.
No worries. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. 1 second.
Everything okay?
Good. All good. We got two of us. There we go. I actually want to conclude with a verse from the bow. And you said perhaps I wanted to be a journalist. Maybe I'm delving into this category in a different way. But we say "V'higata lavincha," that you should tell your children on this day. And that's what I love about our tradition, that we are commanded, not just on Passover, but every single day to tell our stories. And you're right, we pick and choose those stories, but it's not just about our own egos and stories. It's about the stories that we can tell in order to raise others up as well. So I want to thank you for coming on Rabbi on the Sidelines. This is Gary Belsky, New York Times bestseller of this book on the origins of sports, author of many other books, The Answer Guy, Up Your Game. These are just some of the sports books. And most importantly, a mensch and now a friend of Sinai Temple and of Rabbi on the Sideline. Gary, it's so great to have you. Thank you for joining us.
A real treat to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.